Interview with Dean Beyerl, February 24th, 1981. Before we get started, would you like to give me a brief background of how you came to Ball State?
I came in 1953 as a clinical psychologist. Came from the University of Illinois after having earned my degree at Syracuse University in clinical psychology. Put 1 year in a mental institution as a clinical psychologist, and then decided to go into college teaching. Taught at the University of Illinois for 2 years, and then came here and started the Psychological Services Center in 1953.
When did you first become Dean of Students then?
In 1963. From 53 to 63 I taught and was director of the Psych Services Center under 3 deans of students. Then as the dean of students moved to the University of Nebraska, I was appointed dean of students, and next year vice president of student affairs. I believe it was in 1963. So I moved from half-time teaching, half-time administration to almost all administration, with the exception of teaching 1 or 2 psychology courses a year, plus teaching at other universities in the summer.
Okay. Since you've been here from the early 50s, when do you first think the peace movement started growing on the university campus?
Well, I think that's hard to pin down for a particular point, because I don't even recollect when the Vietnam War did start. I don't even, sometime, I guess, in the middle 60s, wasn't it? Something like that. I would tend to feel that some of the feelings were evident when the draft started, and students began to, the requirements of the draft and so on were such that some students were attending college for the wrong reasons, primarily not to have to go into the draft. And I think along with that, there were others who were very sincere in feeling that the military, one, was too aggressive, and they didn't believe in military action as a solution to problems. Probably I'd say middle 60s. I would tend to think, as I recollect, when I took the job in 1963, I had no anticipation that the university was going to be turned into a zoo. I think that the reason I took the job was primarily a feeling that the Psych Services Center wasn't the sole answer to the mental health of students. That environment that they were in and the other people that impacted them, their attitudes and the direction in which you work with students would also have an impact, rather than just direct one-on-one counseling or group counseling. And for that reason, I think I felt as though I'd like to go into administration. The way the health center works with students, the way the residence hall works with a student, impacted the mental health of that student just as much as a counseling or psych services center. So for that reason, I think I moved in. I think if I'd had, as I look back, if I'd had foresight of the peace movement and what it meant in terms of distrust of authority, the chaos, some people feeling as though the university needed to become totally involved in a national effort. I'm not sure that I probably would have stayed in the counseling center.
Do you think that other administrators had the same feelings about the impact of social environment that you had at the time?
Oh, I think there were several at that particular time. It wasn't really true in the early 50s. I think I was about either first or second psychologist on this campus, and Of course, the campus was only 3,000. But by the middle 60s, the counseling center the university had grown from 3,000 to about 10 or 11,000. And there were probably 10, 12, 15 psychologists, several sociologists, social scientists, and so on. And I think that there was generally and our former president was a person who always preached from the time I got here that, and I use the word preached advisedly, but that an education is the sum total of the experiences that a student had. And so it was really a dedication on the part of Ball State. So it wasn't just my idea. The kind of residence halls we built, when one looks at residence halls now that were built during that period of time, they've still held up reasonably well in terms of philosophy. The idea that there'd be only 250 in each hall, or 175 to 250, rather than building gigantic 400 and 500 student halls. Those kinds of things were evident throughout the campus. Mm-hmm. Even in those days, I think probably relatively small classes. The small classes came, or the large classes came later. Mm-hmm. So I tend to think that it was a dedication of Ball State, really. And so there were I think there were several professors and people who felt that, during those periods of time, you knew practically everybody on campus. Mm-hmm. And the environment was beginning to emerge on the other side of Riverside. So that it was a pretty good dedication. I think even today, like yesterday, our residence hall program ranked by University of Georgia Research ranked us in the top 5 in the country in terms of the amount of professional people there are in the halls, the number of students per professional, upkeep of the buildings, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you think the Munchie community felt about the activity as it started growing on campus? Do you feel that there was any hostility?
Yeah, and I think you can't categorize all of the students as being totally dedicated to the peace movement. I think there were a lot who were unaffected, really, in terms of, they were affected in terms of their lives, but on the other hand, they weren't dedicated to going out and demonstrating other kinds of overt actions in terms of, although I would tend to think that the general university community was in general support. The difference probably was in relationship to the methods that were used rather than the support of it. I think that as I look back, and again, of course, my memory isn't that strong, but generally speaking, I think many of the leaders and business people thought there was a bunch of kooks out here, that we really ought to get some pens or some cages and cage them up. And they really didn't understand what the heck was going on out there. Then, of course, I think toward the end of, whether you call it the peace movement or the anti-authority feelings, I think that in the beginning of the 70s, the community began to get educated because the students moved into the community, which caused even more friction. Along with that, there was a loss, the courts began to decide that local parentis was dead and students were citizens like anyone else, and they didn't want to live in the residence halls and be told that what color their rooms were. And so I think the whole general feeling was, you might classify it as a peace movement, but it got beyond that point. It got beyond the point of what I would think of as a structure. Anyone that had authority or that was representing the government, and the government was clear that we were at war. And many students just didn't support it. They thought we were at war for the wrong reasons. So in the direct answer to your question, I don't think we got a lot of support from most of the community. The religious community we did. They understood. And of course, this campus is ringed by religion. I don't know how many churches there are, but I guess probably 40 or 50 that are within a mile of our campus. And the religious council has something like 40 or 50 ministers or religious people that are working on the campus. They understood it.
Could you expand on that?
Yeah, some of the religious leaders, if I'm going to sign the release, I better not give names, but some of them are still around, who every time there was a march or demonstration or something like that, many times they go into the community, several times, but the welcome in the community wasn't as great as a march or some kind of a rally or something on our campus. But some of the religious leaders were up front, organizing it, getting it started. Catholic priest or minister or an assistant minister. And it seemed as though over a period of time, primarily because I attended most of them, they were the same people. Go around and say hello, 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 how are you? Count probably 15, 20 that were the ring leaders and everything. Most of them, that kind of person, it was anti-authority, but in peaceable terms. And I think many of them practiced what they preached. But they really did feel as though there was at peace. They wanted peace at any cost. And there was another group that was not true. But I would think of that as probably the peace movement. Go on retreats and things like that.
Do you have very many recollections, and what were some of them of the faculty involvement? Was it very widespread?
No, it's a judgment. I would tend to think some faculty were more dedicated than others. The social science department, for instance, and they had teach-ins, and I'm sure you've seen those in the daily news. Concerns, some of them, there'd be convocations and some things like this that they'd get together or bring a speaker and they'd be behind it. Use of donations, so on to help. I wouldn't say it was a total faculty effort. It was certain social science departments probably had more of a conscience and more leadership than some of the other departments.
Do you remember Ball State's Vietnam moratorium day?
That was the one where there was 4,000 out. Isn't that the one? Over,
Yes, it was yes, it was a widespread campus movement.
Yeah, it was over on, I think they held their rally over on the Arts Building Terrace. Yeah, I remember. The leader of that was the student body president, who the next year was my graduate assistant, who now has a doctorate in educational psychology. He's been a lifelong friend of mine. Ran a student union at Marquette for a while. Has taken real educational leadership.
What are some of your impressions of that day? Can you remember the atmosphere or the mood of the students?
I don't think you can summarize it in one way. I would tend to think there are two or three things. Of course, you know, it was my responsibility to make sure that there were some who were really sincere and dedicated, and there were others who I would tend to think were just anti-authority and were out to, by their dress, by their manner, their lifestyle. Nobody told them to do anything. And to put restrictions on them was absolutely unacceptable. I would tend to think the average student body went out to see what was going on. There were a few hundred, several hundred that were really dedicated to the peace movement. But I think the majority of students showed up. There were some that were, there were several students who traveled from campus to campus trying to be disruptive. I would tend to think that during those periods of time, we probably spent more time, sorted out the students and spent more time with the disruptive ones than the ones who were really sincere in the peace movement. I think, for instance, the student body president, who later went on and has taken educational leadership, was a very sincere young man. So sincere, he impressed me that he was my graduate assistant the next year. Went on and got his master's here. Those kinds of people had real depth to them. They understood the Vietnam War, the reasons for it, what was behind it, and so on. I think it's like any other movement. The masses of people come out because there was a rally, and it was probably for the right causes.
Do you remember any instances of actual students wanting or supporting Nixon, his war efforts? Do you
It was
remember?
very difficult to get anybody on campus to speak for that whole general conservative point of view. I think they did get Al Cap one time, if you go back and look, he came in and spoke, and then I think he got picked up on a morals charge about a week later, or 2 weeks later, which discredited the whole movement. For some reason or other, he got tangled up with a gal in a motel or something or other. He came on real hard of I love America, and, you know, right or wrong, you ought to come out. But as I recall it, it was very difficult to find somebody who would really come out, speak out, and say, hey. I'd say the last place you'd probably find that would be on a college campus. I can't recall of anyone else. There may have been one or two that came in a convocation. I would tend to think they could turn out people, but they turn them out and then they'd heckle them.
Okay. Are there any other experiences or remembrances you have of the movement on campus?
Oh, there are a lot of them, primarily because I was in the heart of it. I would tend to think one of the persons that probably, well, the whole faculty and the administration, many's the time when you'd get demonstrations for the wrong reasons, even though it would be, you might call it peace movement, but on the other hand, it really was disruptive and anti-authority. I think of the night, for instance, they were raising Cain out, and they were running around the campus, and now President Bell, who was Vice President of Business Affairs, sat with me over on the sign over by Benny for 2 or 3 hours, trying to understand what was going on and so on. Spent a good deal of time with Tom Osborne, making sure that there was people were orderly and there wasn't, you know, it wasn't completely disruptive. And I think it's very difficult to sort it out, because about that same time there was a black movement. There was people who were probably, even though you'd say they were for anti-Vietnam, they were probably the most violent and disruptive people that you'd find. So we spent, Tom Osborne always spent time with him. Night after night, I spent time in the police car. From that point on, I learned to have a police monitor by my bed, and it's still there. So if there's a fire in a residence hall or something, I can wake up like the minute his voice comes on. Spent a lot of time with the city police, campus police, sheriff, making sure that we were coordinated. Most of the time it was orderly. I think sometimes it was contaminated not just with college students, the Burris students were involved in it, and probably a little bit more immature and impulsive. For instance, the big hole in the front of the ad building here, and symbolic of the fact that a bomb would have hit here from Vietnam, and the threat of burning a dog to show that the violences that was in, and that was advertised. Loading buses and young people going to Washington for a demonstration. To some degree working with the FBI to make sure that the campus wasn't being infiltrated by non-student organizers, and they were there. But generally speaking, I would say if your paper is confined primarily to the peace movement and not spreading over or contaminated into some of the other kinds of action, I would tend to think they were a group of sincere, dedicated people who led the movement peaceably. They were the ones who were for the teach-ins and get people educated with the theory that once you understood what was behind the Vietnam War, it didn't make sense. I think in addition to that, there were a whole lot of other contaminating factors that I've mentioned. Another one is just people who just didn't want to go to war, so they went to school. And they weren't students. It was an insult to call them a student. They were putting their time in for 4 years. Some of them going to class, some of them not. And I think during that period of time, some of the rules for liberalization, like pass, fail. You can withdraw any time from class. Didn't need to carry a full load. Well, those kinds of things are happening. But if you're restricted solely to the peace movement, I would tend to think we shouldn't attribute some of the kinds of difficulties that we had on our campus to that peace movement.
Okay. Are there any other comments you'd like to make?
No.
Okay, would you like to conclude the interview then?
What?